Coming up on the live and interactive ACSA legislative lunch break, Edgar and I will get you all of your latest news and information from the state capitol and CDE with an in-depth analysis on how it impacts your school community. Plus, we are joined today by Assemblymember Corey Jackson. We'll talk about legislation that he authored inside the state capitol and what comes next for school communities.
The ACSA legislative lunch break starts now.
It's just after 1 o'clock. We welcome you on a Wednesday to the live and interactive ACSA legislative lunch break, along with Dr. Edgar Zazweta, ACSA's Executive Director. I'm Naj Alikan, ACSA's Senior Director of Marketing and Communications. Welcome. After a couple of weeks off, we'll tell you a little bit about that in just a moment. Go ahead and jump onto the chat today and say hello, Mark Campbell, Superintendent out there at Calaveras Unified ACSA Region 7, our first on the comment section today. Edgar, how are you?
Good, Naj. Happy to be back in here. I know we were just talking about how hadn't done, or at least I feels like I hadn't done it in a while. I know we've had a few things going on here recently. I did get to see a number of our members over the last few weeks. We had a few of our events. We had our Women's Leadership Forum, which is obviously one of the most popular events I think throughout the year. They let me crash their party there for a few minutes. I got to go speak and was in and out. We had our Personnel Institute last week in Long Beach. So it was good to see some of our folks in person.
Yeah, and you know what's funny? You and I were in a cabinet meeting yesterday, and the reflection we got from our Senior Director of Educational Services, the feedback she got, wow, what an incredible event. The first time some of our ACSA members have been to this event. So that is great to hear. I want to ask you, what was the energy like over there? Because I know that you spoke, but had the opportunity to meet so many of the members while you were there. What was the energy like?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think at the Women's Leadership Forum that was the thing that I actually commented on. It was just the vibe, just the vibe that you went in there and felt the energy in the room. Of just the camaraderie about our female leaders from around the state, both celebrating accomplishments. And I think this was always the nice balance. It was celebrating where we've gone as a system while also calling out that there's still a lot of work to do. I mean, some of the statistics, and the one that always comes to mind is, and I think folks, because we're preaching the choir here, we have about 75% of our workforce is females, right? Our start as classroom teachers. Of that 75%, you think about the high, in terms of our district leadership, only 44% of our superintendents are female leaders at this point. And that's an improvement. And that's actually higher than most other states in the country.
Right.
So while, yes, we've seen some growth, it goes without saying that we still have some work to do on that end.
I've just noticed, Edgar, a couple of new names, it looks like, have joined up on the chat. I see Cassandra McNair from Paris Union High School District, and then Lisa Lamb, ACSA Region 12, Lewis Center in Apple Valley. Cassandra and Lisa, if this is the first time you were with us, welcome to the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break family. And I think it would be right of me to say why we weren't here last week. We had a cyber attack here in the building. So Edgar, being the great leader, sent all of us to go work in our COVID type offices because we had no internet access here in the building. I know you and I learned a lot about cyber attacks last week. Is there like one piece of advice you would give to our educators out there having just experienced this for the past week?
Yeah, I joked last week. Well, joke maybe not the right term, but I commented that I didn't know too much. We all see those headlines. We see what happened at LA Unified and some of the other districts about a cyber attack. I'd be lying if I said I knew exactly all that it entailed. And so our organization, like many other folks around the country and here in California, we became susceptible to that, right? Where you had these threat actors, usually international threat actors, get into your systems, try to access some data, and ours was a ransom situation. Luckily, we had a great response team that was able to mitigate some of that impact. While some of those investigations are ongoing, right, and we'll continue to update our members, the impact was definitely limited in terms of what that meant for our membership, what that meant to our systems. So we were able to get out of it in a pretty quick fashion. Now we did have to shut down here our physical offices. The show continued, and we had conferences going on at the same time. So we definitely navigated around that. The piece of advice, I think, more than anything, is what is our plan should one of these situations arise at the district level, at the school level. I know most of our school districts are thinking about that, given some of the high profile cases that we've seen around the country. And how do we protect our data, both for our membership, our students? So I know that's a ever-present conversation around the state, given what's going on around not just our country, around the world, that has been a growing trend, especially for big organizations.
Let's move over to a couple of news headlines before we bring on Corey Jackson, Assembly member from AD 60. We'll take you to Temecula Valley because there's a really interesting story that's in EdSource today on the challenges educators are facing in Temecula Valley Unified. Now, you'll remember this is the district where they banned a history textbook because it referenced Harvey Milk. Then the governor got involved and the district altered their curriculum policy. This article outlines the challenges and tells the story of working in that district through the eyes of classroom teachers. We're going to go ahead and put a link to that story up in our chat so you can take a look at that. Also, want to make you aware of an article that is in Ed Week. School districts may be able to seek a fiduciary benefit from a settlement involving a consulting firm and its alleged role in facilitating the opioid crisis. If the judge finalizes this class action suit and restitution, every district in the country could apply for funds to address rising costs of addressing the opioid crisis on their operations, special education services, counseling. Again, we will post a link for that article in the chat. Also want to just take a moment to promote our show on October 18th. We'll be discussing the transition that school districts are going to be making, changing out their current vehicle fleets to zero emissions vehicles like buses and related infrastructure, and what that means, especially from a monetary standpoint, Edgar, in our school districts, because this is, I mean, it's going to be an expense for our school districts to have to swap out what they currently use for zero emission vehicles. So again, want to remind you, we'll be on that topic coming up on our show.
Yeah, I'll note on that, Naj. I know that that's a hot topic as we've talked to folks around the state in terms of what did that actually mean in practice. And I think we'll hopefully also shed some light. There were some bills in the legislature. There was some action proposed to be taken by the Air Resources Board. There has been some action taken. And so this comes up in our meetings around the state, especially, I would say, for some of our rural communities, that while everybody understands why the state's pushing to go in this direction, concerned about what the implications are for communities that may not have that same infrastructure, right? In terms of what does that mean for electrical vehicles when you have to travel across sometimes mountainous, remote regions without charging stations? What does that mean for some of the programs around the school? So I'm really interested to hear that conversation and get some perspectives from folks on the ground. Also, for some folks who have managed to take some of these initiatives and how have they problem solved on some of that. So I think that'll be a good conversation.
Yeah, I think our guests for that going to be Janet Schulze, who is the superintendent, I believe it's from Pittsburgh Unified, up in the Bay Area, and her transportation director. They will be joining us for that conversation, because I know myself, when I heard about having to change out some of these vehicles, my initial thought went beyond the school buses, beyond, maybe the van pools, and what that's going to mean for even the lawn maintenance equipment. Like, is there a trickle down effect to that? So, it's going to be an interesting conversation, because we're not just talking about the swap out of the vehicles. We're also talking about the technical infrastructure that's going to be required. So that's construction, that's facilities for so many school districts. So we'll be tackling that. We are at the moment monitoring Corey Jackson's his shot in from Assembly District 60. Just so you know, District 60 covers Moreno Valley, covers Paris, where Edgar grew up. So we're monitoring that. I see that that he has just popped up.
Yeah, I mean,
in
no
our
pressure, no
screen.
pressure here for Assembly Jackson, but my parents are constituents, so my family's constituents, so holding them to a high standard there. No, but I know we a lot of mutual acquaintances that are back from the Inland Empire. So I'm obviously, and folks know, I think when we have anybody from the Paris region or Riverside region, I get excited. So Dr.
Yeah.
Jackson, no exception here today.
Well, okay, so now no stress or anything there, Dr. Jackson, as you get ready to come on. Assemblymember Dr. Corey Jackson, District 60, again covering Moreno Valley and Paris down in Southern California. Dr. Jackson, it's an honor to have you here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. Welcome. Let me just start right into this. This is your first year as a California legislator. Give us your reflections in that first year. What's it been like? What are the challenges? What are the successes? Welcome.
Well, thank you for having me. I think overall, of course, as soon as we were sworn in, the governor created a special session. And so I think it's just been go, go, go from the very beginning, from his special session on oil companies to, of course, continuing trying to tackle the most pressing issues that we have in terms of our mental health crisis, in terms of our homelessness crisis. Of course, we had the fear of a recession type budget. Luckily, that did not come into fruition. Of course, insurance issues that have come up, and then, of course, the idea of all the different education issues in terms of attacks on the LGBTQ population, as well as issues of banning of books and the whole politicalization of our education system, well beyond what we've seen in decades.
Assemblyman Jackson, thank you for joining us, and on behalf, thank you for representing my hometown there, and my folks back in Riverside County there.
He's got a lot of pride, Dr. Jackson.
I can see. Look at that smile.
My Paris is on the other screen, so I should have bought it out for today. But so it goes without saying, even in your first year here, like there was some big issues, and you jumped into the middle. You had just alluded to it. I think one of the things that we've been grappling with as a school system, and we talk about it quite frequently on the show, is the bigger cultural war issues that are not specific to schools. I think we see themselves playing themselves out in schools, right? And I would say one of the biggest bills that we saw this year in terms of attention was your bill, AB 1078. So I'll just invite you, and even so, I mean, the bill got signed here recently. You had a video with the governor, which I think we're going to show a little bit of a clip there. That doesn't happen very often, right? This just goes to show how noteworthy of a piece of legislation that was. So for those that may have not been following this, kind of set it up for us. What led you to jump into this issue area? What did the bill do? I know you were working with stakeholders throughout the year, and maybe where things landed, and how you hope this will help the system moving forward.
Well, of course, we began to see earlier on, even last year, when we began to see it being tested on the East Coast and in the South and other conservative states. And I just knew, being someone who grew up in the Inland Empire, that we had pockets that really reflect some of these more conservative states. And so I knew it was just a matter of time before it actually hit California. Didn't realize it was actually that the Inland Empire would be ground zero for this fight. But I introduced this bill in January before you saw the more alarming issues in Temecula and Chino and Murrieta and other places, Corona Norco, I knew it was important for me to introduce the bill, and if it was needed, at least we had it readily available at hand to deal with the issue. So I just think it was more of just understanding how these issues work, understanding how the conservative, white supremacist, Christian nationalist movements work. And it just turned out to be the right time. And then, of course, keeping the governor's office abreast on what's going on. And he chose my bill to be the vehicle to make sure that we stop this in its tracks. And so, of course, is every freshman's legislator's dream come true to be able to have a bill that is touted by the governor, working closely with the governor on this, and we got it done. And although California is the second um, state to actually approve a ban on book bans in California, in the United States, California actually is the first to actually enact these laws. So as soon as the governor's signature was put on the bill, it became law immediately. And the Illinois law will be taking effect in January.
Dr. Jackson, I'm going to ask you a question that, us as an organization have been confronting this, just like we saw the legislature trying to deal with this. And then you alluded to it, Riverside has become ground zero in many ways for some of these conversations. I think if one thing that the pandemic showed us is how diverse the views around this state. I mean, people think of California. We talked to some of our counterparts from around the state. They're like, oh, they just assumed that, California, because of the reputation, maybe because of whatever our leadership looks like in terms of a party preference or whatnot, that we don't have some of these interesting conversations. One question that comes to us, and I think our school leaders are trying to battle with this, is what is the appropriate role for parental rights, if you will. And I know that that's even keying it that way, it can be controversial, but just this whole notion of involving parents, how much community should be involved in these decisions, whether it be books, whether it be curriculum. Given that you've seen this playing out in your backyard, what would you say to that, especially for the folks who may not agree with the methodology or with the state getting involved? Of shouldn't parents have a say about what should be in the library or in the curriculum? What's your response to that?
I think my response is we've been dealing with this since we've all been in the public school system. If my mom did not want me to participate in the sex education class in 6th grade, right? She can sign a slip and then I will be taken out of the class. However, the rest of the students whose parents didn't mind could participate, right? If I didn't want, if my parent didn't want me to watch a certain movie that was shown to the class, they can let them know that they'll find another location for me, and the rest of the children whose parents didn't mind could participate. And so I think it's the same thing. But one thing is for sure: one parent or a group of parents who don't want their child to see this should not be able to dictate what other parents' children can do or watch as well. So we need to make sure that we continue to confine this and not allow them to dictate and control the access to information for other children as well.
I'm going to ask one follow up, Dr. Jackson, and then we'll move on from this. You had mentioned, I just want to actually quote you here. Didn't expect the Inland Empire would be the center of this book banning issue. Since the governor has signed it, what's the feedback been like, especially from educators out there? Is there a comfortability now that this is in place? And I ask that because in our opener, before you were able to join us, we talked about an article that was just published in EdSource, which talks about what some of the educators in Temecula Valley, where this story started, what it's like for them right now through their lens. Have you been able to hear from educators since this has been signed about, their feelings on this?
I've got nothing but thank yous. And even since I introduced the bill back in January, they continue to tell us, even those teachers and parents in Temecula and other places, they needed help and they asked and they pleaded for help. And I'm just glad we were able to give it to them. Now, I also think that, of course, in my district, I don't have this issue. But of course, I'm watching that as well. And so I didn't get the pushback in terms of my own constituents. But we have to understand that when one place pops up its ugly head, we have to be careful because it can easily spread. And I would just also say that it's just as from a human history standpoint, that I really took this more of, a time of history and a time of our sacred responsibility to making sure that we fight against hate and marginalization and oppression, in order for the next generation to be better off than we are. And so this was really more of a moral stance. This was more of a moral imperative that we make sure that we meet this moment in history.
Dr. Jackson and Carolina actually asked a good question, and I know we alluded to this because the bill, and we talked about your legislation over the course of the year, and I know it evolved. So just in summary form, folks are asking, okay, so where did things end up? What if you summarize your bill, what would you say it does? What's the change in law there?
Basically, if a school district is going about its normal business and its normal evaluation of curriculum and going through the appropriate process of starting with teachers and parents looking over books and curriculum before it goes to the school board for final adoption, this bill does nothing, absolutely nothing, to change that process. However, if a school district decides to not adopt curriculum based upon a protected class, meaning you're not adopting this book or curriculum because you say there's elements of CRT in it, that it talks about the history of slavery and Southern white folks' participation in that. If it talks about LGBTQ history and lived experiences, those things are protected by law. And if a district bases their rejection of these books or curriculum based upon those things that are protected by law, then the state has the opportunity to come in, has the opportunity to investigate, and has the opportunity to levy fines, or even purchase the book or curriculum for the school district, and then send the district the bill that they now owe the state. And so this is really just a bill to making sure that there's more checks and balances of those who are misusing the educational system for political gain.
Folks, want to remind you, if you have any questions for Dr. Jackson, Assembly Member from District 60, go ahead and put those into the chat. I know some of you guys have already been doing that. Okay, so now that we've handled that, the book banning legislation, let's talk about the next session. What are you seeing? What are you considering as proposals for bills, for legislation? What's that next big issue for you?
Number one, the next issue that we weren't able to take care of in this bill is the LGBTQ student outing of students to their parents, and who could be some actual parents who do harm to these children. And so that's going to be, you're going to see that right out the back in January being tackled. Of course, we have to continue to double down on the student mental health crisis that we're in, and we're going to continue to find ways to pump in resources and make it easier for young people to be able to be served on school campuses, and through other means to making sure that the mental health crisis is stabilized. And then, of course, one thing that's in the purview of my chairmanship of the Human Services Committee is we just saw a very grotesque report on the nation's childhood poverty rate increasing. And so, as we know, poverty will also have an effect on educational outcomes as well. And so you'll definitely see a big push for me on dealing with that crisis also.
Dr. Jackson, you were a school board member in the past and now as a legislator. How have you incorporated some of that experience that you've had as a school board member into your role now as a legislator?
Well, it helps me to understand the process and how people actually think, and how administrators think, right? And sometimes, unfortunately, I always tell people, let me be the bad guy, but just tell me what's going on, right? Because a lot of times, a lot of things are political, and people are afraid to be able to risk their own jobs or risk their own ability to be able to function in their own schools. And too often, I say too often, and actually Martin Luther King wrote about it in his letter in the Birmingham jail, is that sometimes we prioritize um, stability and peace over justice. And we have to make sure that we continue to prioritize justice. And yes, it might create some uncomfortableness. It might create some perceived instability in the beginning. But as long as we're on the right side of history, it's a fight worth having. And unfortunately, the way our systems are created, it doesn't really allow for those who have great hearts and great problem solving skills and actually, have the means to actually make some of these changes, don't do so. And so I think it's important for the legislature to step in those cases to make sure that the hard decisions are being made.
Yeah. Dr. Jackson, you just actually, I think, answered probably. I was going to ask you one final question of which I alluded to earlier, that I don't have to tell you, given, where you sit in the communities that you serve, that it feels like the situation, given some of these broader societal challenges and these culture wars, as we talk about, are I think the perception from our end and even from our members that things are getting tougher, not easier, right? And we're going into election season. We're going to have a presidential election where, these school issues are going to get highlighted, if nothing else, because we've seen that these are national conversations. So you as a policymaker, our folks as educators, what would you say? How do we keep the focus on students? How do we make sure that, our folks are, amongst all the noise, doing what they can to really protect and serve students, and do their jobs on a daily basis, which is providing those services? I know it feels like it's increasingly becoming tougher given what's happening not only in our state but around the country. What would you say to that?
I would say first, let's just understand that this whole thing that's been going on with book bans and the outing of LGBTQ students is a political strategy. You have to understand that. There's been memos from political organizations and political parties who have created this issue. And because of that, I would just say it's important to ignore the noise and then just do the job that you've been given, right? And that you do very well already. Don't do this knee-jerk reaction to things, because when you do knee-jerk reactions, then it affects the climate of the schools. Then it affects young people, right? And so I would just say hold the line. History is asking us to hold the line, and history will be on our side at the end of the day. So I would just say ignore the noise and knee-jerk reactions. You know what needs to be done. And sometimes you might just have to tell people no. And if they get mad, just accept it, but continue to hold the line. Because unfortunately, I have more bad news for you. This year was only the practice season. This was only practice of what they're doing to see which strategies work the best. Next year, it will be worse. And so we have got to make sure that we're ready for it.
Well said. Dr. Corey Jackson, Assembly Member District 60 down in Southern California. Dr. Jackson, it's been an honor to have you here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. We hope you come back and see us again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And it's been a pleasure working with your folks in Sacramento as well, in partnership on these important policies.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. Edgar will summarize in just a second. Want to remind all of you, if you like what you've seen, we invite you to subscribe to us on YouTube or like us on Facebook. You'll get instant alerts when we're about to come on the air with breaking news. You also get reminders for our normal Wednesday show here on ACSA Facebook and ACSA YouTube. And if you have great stories happening in your school community, we want to tell your stories. Send your photos, your bullet points, your news releases to our EdCal editor, Michelle Carl at mcarl@axa.org. Also want to remind you, ACSA's Leadership Summit is coming up first week of November in Sacramento. Here's a preview. Going to be an incredible event. ACSA Leadership Summit in Sacramento, November 2nd through 4th. You can register for that event, axa.org/professional-learning. Edgar, this was, I want to just point out, among the number of things that Dr. Jackson just said, it was great to talk with him. Something really hit me at the end, which I think is something that probably a lot of our educators know, our education leaders know, is coming, but maybe they actually needed to hear it from somebody who's an elected leader. He said, this is a practice year. It's going to get tougher. We've talked many times, Edgar, you and I and many of us here at ACSA, about it's not an easy job. Education leaders, it's not just about right now teaching the students. They have myriad other things that they have to deal with. But actually hearing it from a lawmaker, this was the practice year, it's going to get tougher, I think gives us a different lens really about how we have to look at these things, because whatever challenges we've been experiencing now, there's only going to be more of them.
Yeah, I think that was my biggest takeaway. It's something, he just reiterated, I think, what we've already known and what we were saying there at the beginning, that just given how much energy there's been on some of these issues, and we just talked about a few of them, that there's going to be more. I think the challenge for us as an organization, I think for us in trying to support our members, is how do we now try to give our folks, regardless of how folks feel about any of these myriad of issues, because I'm not contending, I know there's even diversity of opinion about many of these issues that are playing around the state, and regardless of where folks stand on the particular issue, that they do cause a distraction. They cause a distraction from the core business of what our education system is supposed to be, and it's serving kids. So how do we make sure that us as an organization are supporting those policies that really will support our students first and foremost, that will enable our folks to do the work, to help their folks and their teams at the school and district level do their work, and then hopefully minimize a little bit that noise, or be a buffer, if you will, to some of that noise. Some of that is, I say all this with eyes wide open, that some of the most harshest and the politics that gets people most energized out of everything is local, right? And in all of these cases, these have been local issues that have galvanized statewide attention. So what can we do to support as these things pop up around the state? I think is something that we as ACSA are constantly thinking about.
Edgar and I will not be on the air next Wednesday. We have our governance meetings down in Ontario. Somehow I got to try and twist your arm, Edgar, to come to the restaurant that I go to whenever we're in Ontario for the burrito.
Is this the 2-pound burrito? Or
the one that goes from elbow to wrist. I got to see if I can get you to.
You may have to take a picture of that burrito. I'm not committing to trying that burrito myself, but I'd like to see a picture. I think you've shown me a picture in previous years.
Before and after, I'll get one of the employees there to shoot that. But we are back on the air October 18th, talking about zero emissions vehicles and infrastructure. Folks, thank you so much for joining us here on the live and interactive ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. Remember, we are live Wednesdays here on ACSA Facebook and ACSA YouTube. Have a great rest of the week, and we'll see you next time.